So a huge thanks to International Master Christof Sielecki for sending me his Keep It Simple 1d4. Already own this beauty, award-winning. If you compare the two, you can see there's a little bit more material in his new 1d4 book. And really what he does is he presents a repertoire based around 1d4, knight f3, g3, bishop g2, castles, and only later, if appropriate, c4. And that's a repertoire that's then, a setup that's used against pretty much everything. And the book goes through all possible responses, whether it be Benko, Dutch, Queen's Indian, Catalan, whatever. And it is written in Christof's typically winsome, to the point, economic way. Even a chess player like me, I understand what's going on with his explanation, but it isn't too wordy either, as some chess authors can be. Neither are the lines overwhelming. You get just as much as you need. You're also given hints where you could do a little bit more work yourself in analysis where it's necessary or required, but you get the bare bones in order to be, or more than the bare bones, you get the bare bones and all you need to be confident playing with 1d4. Well, I had to pause the video because of an invasion in my office. I wanted to just briefly look at a couple of lines from the book to give us a feel for what it might look like when you start looking at in detail. The first question I had is, what does he recommend against the Benko? You know, he's published the Benko repertoire on Chessable, and I've gone through it all and I love it. And you might well be surprised to find that after b5, and the idea is then queen b6 and following, on move 4, he gives a move that he didn't canvass, I don't think, at all in the Benko repertoire, namely c3. And this involves a lot of new analysis in the book. So if you're confronting someone who's read up in Keep It Simple 1d4 and all you know is the Benko repertoire, you're going to be thinking for yourself from move 4 onwards. Now, what does he suggest against the King's Indian defence? And I ask this question because I'm going through Kamil Plichter's repertoire on Chessable at the moment. I probably butchered his name, apologies Kamil, but this is fun because here we see two Chessable authors, an FIDE master and an international master, squaring off, as it were, in their repertoires. And as you'd expect, and as I said earlier on, d4, knight f3, g3, bishop g2, castles, and only then would there be a potential c4. But following d6, which is the King's Indian defence setup, Christof actually opts for b3. The reason for this is that it will take people out of book, because this is a relatively unknown system, but it's one that has been used to great effect by, I think, Kramnik is who he mentions. Plus, a King's Indian defence player is up for a fight, and this is a way of taking the poison out of the position. You put your king, I mean, look at the king on g1, perfectly safe before taking any operations. Of course, the King's Indian defence player will have opportunities to sharpen the game anyway, and we'll see that is in Kamil's own repertoire recommendation. But it follows in this way. So e5. Now here, not knight takes nice juicy pawn, but after this variation, you know, knight g4. I mean, look at that pin along the diagonal. And it would just be a hopeless position. I mean, if you want to keep the knight on the board there and swap it off, you're forced into this kind of position, and no white player in their right mind is going to look at this for any length of time. So the move here is bishop a3 attacking the rook on f8. Now this is all Kamil Plicher's recommendation as well as Christof's. Christof here goes for the strategically promising c4 following Kramnik, rather than putting the knight on c3, because then you've got the knight behind the pawn on c4. So black needs to be careful not to fall into a passive position here and get squished off the board, which could happen after let's say c6, which is one of the popular moves in this position. Christof Sielecki presents the following variation, and essentially following this position says, well, black, what can you do? How can you improve your position? Where are you going to play? Whereas white has room for maneuver and improvement on the queen side. Black, solid, though doesn't have many prospects. In this line, by the way, looking at this more passive c6 response, another way of responding to this, rather than knight a6, is knight b to d7. And this is another interesting aspect of Christof Sielecki's book, because he leans on Lila 0. And Lila 0, and I think it's the first time he's used Lila 0 in one of his books, if I remember rightly from the Perpetual Chess podcast interview with him. But Lila 0 recommends g4, which is a creative way of dealing with this position. If the knight takes g4, then of course the pawn in the middle falls, and that juicy looking square on d6 opens up. Anyway, the main line continues after knight g4 with knight c3, knight d5, and here we have a big break, a choice to make. Christof thinks that the best line for black is e takes f2. He calls knight a6 in this position lame. We'll come back to that. But e takes f2, and then some dancing around with the knight and the king, and we end up in a position that Christof thinks is promising for white. And he offers one long variation to justify this judgment, which is typical. He will give a general judgment about a position at the end of a shorter variation, and then offer a couple of lines to substantiate that view. And this is one of those lines. It's a fairly complicated line here that involves offering up the exchange temporarily before getting it back. But either way, we reach this position as the end result, and surely white is doing well here. A pawn down, admittedly. White doesn't have an h-pawn, but look at that sorry knight over on a6, and the way those bishops are raking across the entire board. But back to that key moment, because Kamil Plicher recommends knight a6 in this position, not e takes f2. Now, as I said, lame, says Christof Sielecki, and this is where we'll have two chessable authors facing off against one another. The variation continues. Some of these moves are reasonably forced or just plain natural. And then we reach this position, which is where Christof Sielecki ends his analysis, and he's fairly confident that white is doing well and doesn't continue the analysis. However, Kamil continues by pointing to the following variation, and then rook b8, which he says completely equalizes the position. I mean, the pawn is hanging on e2, of course on a7 as well, but if we just defend that pawn on f3, then that bishop on f8 suddenly gets very active, and that pawn on c5 looks tender. So there's analysis ongoing with masters and international masters in this line at the moment, but you can see how deep we've been taken into the position. And the thing with Christof Sielecki is that he explains it with such eloquence so that you understand what's going on, so that even someone like me can understand it. Anyway, I better get going. The family's causing a riot in the background. A huge thanks again to Christof for this fantastic book. What a great set of variations that don't require a lot of maintenance, fairly easy to understand and to memorize. Highly recommended.